Okay, stream is up, I think. Yeah, there we go. Delete that. All right. And make sure my sound is, actually working. Because I've had that happen before. Oops. Okay. All right. So, as a reminder, mostly, I guess, for my online folks, today is when the final paper is due. So, if you're working on that, try to get it in by the end of the day. You can email it to me. I've had a lot of people send it through Blackboard. It works. I've never used Blackboard like that before, but I guess you can. Just again, preferably attach it as a file, a Word file, or a PDF document. One or the other. Because just sending me a link to a Google Docs often makes me send the person back like a permission request, essentially, to be able to view it. And if which I'm going to have, a bunch stacked up, that's going to hinder me getting everything graded. And I might just move on to the next one and forget to come back to yours because you all won't be the only one that's done that. So just make it so I can get into it immediately, if you can. Next Monday is our actual final day of class. That's when we'll do the review. And then next Wednesday is the final. Well, for you online folks, I'll probably put it up on Tuesday, so I have the full week like usual. But in here, it's Wednesday, 8:30. It's 8:30 to 10:30. You're not going to need that much time, but you have it. I think that's everything. Any questions about anything? Okay. So, let's try and knock the rest of this chapter out. And I realized when I was going over the test to print out to do the review tomorrow for my Tuesday, Thursday class, I do have a little bit in chapter 10. If I don't get to that today, I'll just briefly mention what points we're going to talk about on review day. So it's just a couple really easy questions. So it's not a bunch of extra stuff. Anyway, so we finished here with basically the expanding of internal improvements, which again, roads, steamboats, canals, etc. The main one being specifically the Erie Canal, where everyone else is there, which turned New York City into what it is today. That's why New York City is the big city in America, is because of the Erie Canal. Because it not only made it easier to move stuff through New York, but since it connected to, you can tell from the name, the Erie, or Lake Erie Lake, which itself is connected to all the other Great Lakes, you now have basically water access as far west as Wisconsin and, the western part of Michigan. Michigan's closer. So you've got all of the Midwest essentially able to funnel their goods through the Erie Canal and out to the Atlantic for significantly cheaper than trying to send it over land. So yeah, huge economic deal, obviously, with railroads and eventually, planes and stuff. The Erie Canal very much lost its prominence, but it was the major economic waterway, at least in America. We didn't have, the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal yet. All right. Oh yeah, this is we're starting to swing our weight around a little bit. We technically survived the War of 1812. Sent, let's see, John Quincy Adams to London to discuss issues with Britain when it comes to like the territory or the not territory, the border between America and Canada, limiting great naval presence on the Great Lakes because again that was this weirdly contested region of battleships on these huge lakes. Set the U.S.-Canadian border, yada, yada, yada. Joint U.S.-British occupation of the Oregon Territory, which becomes a thing later, but obviously not really for us. There's also the issue of the southern border. Spain was constantly growing its power, even though, as we've seen, it's not really that much of a world power anymore, but neither were we, so it was still worth worrying about. But also the Seminole natives down in Florida were expanding into former Creek land due to the Creeks being, I wouldn't say wiped out, but they were very heavily weakened by the War of 1812. So they were pouring into former Creek land. We decided to send Andrew Jackson down, you know, the guy that's famous for murdering natives, to try to make peace with the natives. Yeah, he didn't do that. In fact, he nearly caused a massive war. He attacked 2 Spanish forts, hanged 2 Seminole chiefs, and killed 2 British citizens that were working with the natives. So he pissed off everybody. However, Britain and Spain were just tired of dealing with this. The British overlooked it. It's like, okay, well, these guys were, you know, down there working with the natives, and that wasn't really, it wasn't like an official capacity for Britain, so they were like, you know, shit happens. The Spanish decided they didn't feel like going to war with us, and sold their land east of the Mississippi, which is to say, hey, we've got Florida now. So this was the Adams-Onis Treaty, 1819. In very few dates you guys actually have to worry about for me. But this did lead to the Monroe Doctrine, which is probably the more important thing on this page. So under President Monroe, there was this policy, because it was not like an act or a law that's put into place, but it's essentially saying that European powers need to keep their hands off of the Americas. Mainly because all these countries, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, had all thrown off Spain, and so Spain was trying to take them back, and that was going to cause a lot of unrest in the region, and so Monroe was like, you know, well, for one, we extended diplomatic relations to these countries immediately, which is something important to distinguish a rebellion from a revolution, although that's probably maybe not the best way to say that. But if no other countries extend diplomatic relations to a country that has declared independence, they're not seen as officially being a country. But since the U.S. immediately was like, hey, we're going to recognize these as new countries, they are officially on the world stage new countries. So Spain going in and reconquering them wouldn't be just an internal Spanish matter of her colonies are in rebellion. It would be Spain invading another country. So it's a whole lot of political crap, but it's important on the world stage. So pretty early on, I say, by this point we were trading all over the world at this point. Let's see, trading in Mexico, China, Britain. We were even looking to the Pacific for actual like colonial expansion, which we'll get into next semester. And this is where some of our big cities really came into prominence. Providence, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, etc. became like these manufacturing towns, or cities, rather. um, as we're getting more and more into the proper industrial revolution. Um, yeah, so there is Andrew Jackson doing his war crimes like usual. And we'll see a lot more of this next semester as well, because this is very important in how we begin to um, settle our affairs in North and South America, except for Canada, of course. We're not going to bother Canada anymore. We've already got our butts kicked over that in the War of 1812. But as far as like Mexico, Central America, South America, there's this idea of like, oh, well, these countries are free from their colonial powers, so they should be left alone. But also, as we'll see with Theodore Roosevelt, also are now ours to mess with as we see fit, which you really see during like the Cold War, when we're sending the CIA in to like topple governments because they're not doing exactly what we want them to do. But anyway, I don't exactly remember what country this one was. I don't know what that flag is, but this is another sort of Central/South American thing where this would be Prussia and Britain. I guess they had holdings in that area and they withdrew, and now they're safe under the Monroe Doctrine. It's a whole thing. Anyway. So the American system we mentioned under Henry Clay, which can also be said to include all this internal improvement. One thing this did, and what it was meant to do, was to tie the country closer together, because as I've mentioned offhand a couple of times, we almost had like the states west of the Mississippi just secede and become their own thing, because it was so difficult to actually get back and forth from those regions. Like, it was easier to send communication to Britain, which again, a month away by boat, than it was to send communications over the Appalachians to these frontier towns on the other side of the Appalachians. Like, that's how non-existent, I was going to say bad, non-existent our transportation was. So with more of this opening up, it tied the country together, but it also meant that since the country was more close together economically, regions could begin to really specialize in what they did best and not have to worry about surviving on their own, which is going to be a problem come Civil War for us in the South, but we'll get to that. Well, we're not going to get to that this semester, but you'll see why that's a problem. So, for example, in the South, the Creek natives being forced out, and Florida now being sold to the U.S., all this land becomes more for cotton, because again, we've got the cotton gin, short staple cotton is easy to grow pretty much everywhere, and now the issue of short staple cotton is pretty much taken care of with this extremely cheap and easy to build yourself machine. Of course, though, as we're spreading more cotton, it's going to spread more slavery, because that's just how that goes. And of course, if you're growing, and this is something you guys probably learned in like middle school, the idea of crop rotation, where if you grow the same crops on the same soil for years and years and years, it will just wipe out the nutrients in the soil. Like, that doesn't just come from nothing. Like today we have, you've got fertilizers and manure and all of that. Back then they just planted crap in the ground and hoped for the best. And after, again, a few years, not just a few decades, the soil would be completely unusable. This is when we had stuff like George Washington Carver with, like, if you plant peanuts or soybeans or something in the field for a year, it will return nutrients back to the soil, because that's how those plants work. And then the next year you can do this, but they were so focused on the short term, as much cotton as possible right now, They just didn't bother, and so when their soil, uh, not running dry isn't the right word. When the soil got exhausted, they just head west for places that haven't been farmed yet. Um, so while they're focusing mostly on cotton and almost nothing else, they're also not even growing their own food or like manufacturing their own stuff, which again we see in the Civil War when we don't have like any industry. Um, so for the North, we traded cotton for shoes and cloth, just basic manufactured goods. And then out west is where they were largely growing food, because especially north of the I haven't gotten to the Missouri Compromise yet. We'll get that in a minute. Um, but north of where slavery was no longer allowed, they were still growing things other than cotton. So, for example, James and Dolly Madison, when they returned to their plantation in Montpelier, were not able to continue growing cotton because the soil had just been worn out. So, just to give a specific example. We had Cincinnati becoming a major city, again, thanks to the cotton trade. 1811, it was a little frontier town, and by 8 years later, so 1819, it was a proper city, which is an insane amount of growth in such a short period of time. In the Northeast, while they were manufacturing, most of their fortunes were still tied in with the cotton industry. Northern merchants would put warehouses down here in the South, Charleston and Savannah, etc., which I've got a statistic, chapter 10, about like most of the U.S. economy was on cotton at this point. That said, oh, no, that was a different slide. So merchants in the Northeast focused on cotton trade. You had Philadelphia and Pittsburgh doing tools for farmers out west, and again, farmers out west were the ones typically growing the food for the rest of the country. So each region was specializing, which isn't a bad thing, but that means if you want to try to split off and do your own thing, you're not able to sustain yourself. So here is the roads, also railroads. Roads and canals would be what we're looking at. Railroads not yet. So you've got lots of roads here, which, again, nothing like the interstate today. Although, I don't know, you go far enough north, it feels like it's just gravel road. And you can see all the canals up here in the north. These aren't rivers, these are canals. These dark blue. See, a lot of interconnectedness. And again, you can see here with the Erie Canal, it goes from New York, it connects to the Albany River, and then you can go all the way up, and it connects all of the lakes, which means all of this can now trade through here, and that becomes very, very important. It's pretty much the whole economy. There's Cincinnati. This is, for me, a real good image of just like you can almost see the change in real time. Like over here you've got these steamboats, which, by the way, these were like real expensive, real huge steamboats. The perception is a little bit weird. You can see how small the people are here, but they're never here. I don't know. The perception is weird. But these are huge. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just boiling water, and then the steam goes up and it moves the turbines and makes the paddles go. I mean, that's literally how nuclear power plants work. Rather than coal, they use nuclear fission to make heat to run a turbine. It's real weird when you think, oh, nuclear energy is so advanced. It's like, it's just this, but not coal. It's just, but they had a huge boiler, as you can tell from the smokestacks. And sometimes those things would explode. Yes. But again, this is the, I guess, Ohio River Cincinnati's on. And you've got like the horses, buggies, even like covered wagons over here, people that are heading further west. But then you've also got a pretty modern looking city growing just right across the river. Well, I mean, on the river technically. And yeah, it's the road's still dirt, but it's a proper city now. It's just still kind of in this flux stage. Okay, so quick economic thing. There was an issue in 1819. Again, if you look back through American history, it's like every 30 years our economy craps itself. So, yeah. Issues with banking, overseas demands, yada, yada, yada. Banking loans to American settlers. Banks were giving loans to American settlers without proper collateral. And also Europe was like pulling back on its gold and silver investments into the U.S. due to stuff happening in South America, probably all the various revolutions from Spain. I've still not really even looked into that. And then with the Napoleonic Wars ending, Europe doesn't need American agriculture as much because they're growing their own food again. And so our farmer profits were dropping pretty substantially. I mean, you're going down by a third. So middle. The money supply was still expanding, but we didn't have hard gold and silver in the banks because, again, Europe had been pulling their investments out to shore up whatever was going on with them. So if we kept printing money with no expansion in the actual gold and silver in the supply, that would just cause inflation, which again simply means the money isn't worth as much as it used to be. So the Second Bank of America tightened credit on the branch banks to try to keep this from happening. Well, this caused an economic panic. Banks shut down. Other banks called in their loans to try to keep from shutting down, but the people who had taken these loans were typically farmers who had used the loan to either buy the farm or plant the crops for that season, and they didn't have the money yet. They needed to wait until harvest time. So it just caused this huge economic issue all across the country. Cotton farmers were hit hard because, again, as we said, they often went into debt to do this, and now the debt that they were going to pay back over time was being called in all at once, and you can't pay what you don't have. Some states try to tax branch banks. Others printed money without specie, which again, gold and silver, which just meant that money was not worthless because it wasn't being printed and saying, oh yeah, this is totally worth gold and silver we have, but the more paper money you have out there when the gold and silver hasn't expanded means that all of that paper still needs to be able to cover whatever the gold and silver is in the bank. So the more of the paper money you have, the less each bit of it is worth. So Congress were trying to figure out how to relieve this. Northern merchants wanted more tariffs. Southern planters did not because it would hurt them. Agricultural prices were dropping because, again, Europe didn't need our agricultural products as much. So not only were we dealing with this economic panic, but people were making less money just because stuff wasn't selling. And there was no real, this is the thing that fixed it. It just kind of went away. Because the economy does typically right itself after a few years. But there was no, the New Deal like we see in the Great Depression where the government is working really hard to help the people. And the point of all of this is this. People remain skeptical of the federal banks. And so post this, which is Andrew Jackson running for president. Um, that's why, because people didn't trust the banks, and there was this whole thing about that with the Andrew Jackson run for presidency. So just keep, for all of this, mostly keep this in mind. People don't like the banks, which, I mean, you still see that today. Like, oh, I'm not putting my money in a bank. I'm putting it under my mattress. It's like, okay, well, collect interest like that, I guess. And there's this whole thing, new edition of Macbeth, the bank's ghost. Yeah, there's a lot happening here. I can't quite keep up with everything because again, a lot of these are like at the time. I wouldn't say inside jokes, but the references that would make sense if you were there, living in the era. So some of this I don't fully get, but yeah, it was very much on people's minds. Speaking of things on people's minds, Missouri, which, if you're familiar with at all with Missouri, yeah, obviously that's going to cause an issue, just Missouri in general. I work with a guy from Missouri, so I'm going to say that. So, February of 1819, Missouri not decided to become a state. It got enough population to become a state and apply for statehood so they could have all the proper, rights and whatnot of a state. But obviously, due to where Missouri is, there was the debate over how it was going to be handled as a slave state or a free state. New York Congressman James Talmadge Jr. wanted to ban the importation of slavery, or slaves in general, and then gradually emancipate those there because as a territory there isn't really a specific law one or the other. So it's typically slavery in these territories until otherwise stated because 1800s. Obviously, the congressmen from the South rejected this because they wanted another slave state. Because, again, where it was, it had the precedent of, it's bordering the Northwest Territory, which has slavery outlawed. But also it borders Kentucky and Tennessee, which have slavery. So it's like it's this literal middle ground, literally physically middle ground. And they had to figure out what they were going to do with it. Obviously, Southern congressmen wanted a new slave state because it would give them more senators specifically, because the free states had higher populations, therefore they had more people in the House of Representatives. And obviously, when it came to the people actually going in and living there, Missouri was good land for plantations. I mean, it's here in the South. Also, though, there was this concern among Southern planters that if slavery was outlawed there when it had been legal for some time, it would encourage slaves to revolt, which had been happening more in the previous decades. Again, there's this specter of, but what if the Haiti Revolution happens here? It's like, well, then maybe you deserve it. But anyway. And at the same time, Maine tried to declare statehood. Again, it had been like part of Massachusetts up until this point for some reason, even though like New Hampshire and Vermont were now like separate states, so it was no longer physically connected. Anyway, Maine is going to become its own state. Southern congressmen blocked it because Maine's not going to be a slave state. What are they going to do? It's forests and moose. And you don't mess with the moose. So we eventually got to the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay worked out a compromise that would hopefully not only fix the issue, but also set up a solution for future issues, because this was going to continue to happen. There's going to be states showing up on this border between the free and slave states. So Maine will be admitted as a free state. Obviously, there's not really any debate with that. Missouri would be a slave state because, of course. But the main thing here is that the southern border of Missouri was now considered a boundary line between the free and slave states. So any more territory that is made that are made as states, I can't speak, in the Louisiana Territory, if they're south of the border of or the southern border of Missouri, they'll be a slave state. If they're north of that, they'll be a free state. Just don't argue over it. We made this decision. Again, this became known as the Missouri Compromise, which is like Henry Clay's big thing. But it also showed just how quickly congressmen will come to blows over this, and how much of an issue slavery was. Again, not just in like the very obvious moral implications, but like just over the economics and politics of what it represented. And when I say it bordered the Northwest Territory and also Kentucky and Tennessee, it was mostly the Northwest Territory. And then also a little bit down here for Kentucky and Tennessee. So it wasn't like it was literally right here in the middle. It's way over here. It's pretty far north, relatively speaking. But I mean, you still do have Virginia and Kentucky and whatnot that are slave states. So they're like, in terms of northernness, I guess you could argue that, but whatever. Anyway, so that's the point. Everything south of this, slave states. Everything north of this, free states. Because to be fair, the further north you went, the less good the land was for like growing cotton and stuff. You still have a ton of like wheat and whatnot out here, but they had machines for that. A little blip here on the voting, the shift in voting for the era, which again gets into what we'll see with Andrew Jackson. So for the most part, I mean, really since Washington, basically, every president has been some rich elite from Virginia, and since 1800, it had all been Democrat or Republicans. So, like, people weren't really bothered with national elections. They didn't feel like it was really necessary because it was always going to be the same dudes. It's always going to be the same rich white guy from Virginia. And that doesn't really represent a lot of the country. But that's where most of the population is at this point. So, again, few people actually focused on the national level of politics, but they were still pretty enthusiastic about like local and state stuff going on. And after the Panic of 1819 and people realizing that, hey, the government's not doing much to help us, oh, right, only a tiny percentage of people can actually vote in the U.S. And I'm not actually talking about women and African Americans here. I just mean men. A small fraction of white men could actually vote at this time because our democracy was very qualified early on, and that was how it was intended. So there was this push to expand voting rights. So, for example, in New York State, Martin Van Buren wanted to eliminate the property qualifications altogether. Specifically, again, for men. But this meant that you could be a white man, at least in New York State, and you could vote regardless of whether you own land or not, or if you owned enough property in order to be able to vote. Obviously, this did not spread to the other groups, as I mentioned, Native Americans, women, free blacks, completely excluded. We did have, of course, we've talked about New Jersey multiple times, but here it is again, in case you guys need to be reminded. New Jersey, if you were single or widowed and owned land, you could vote. However, after 1807, women and free blacks were excluded because while the number of women and free blacks who did own land owned enough land to be able to vote was still pretty small. It was big enough that it could actually shift local elections. And we couldn't have that. So, yeah. They're like, well, this has been a fun experiment. We're going to get rid of it now because it's actually started to affect the white man. Speaking of which, while New York State completely got rid of the property qualifications for white men, they actually raised the property qualifications for black men, which meant that if you were a black man in New York, you could technically vote, but only if you owned a pretty sizable amount of property. And considering black men owning property at all in the country at this time was pretty rare, yeah, it was very specifically aimed to just like get rid of the vote for them without actually saying we're getting rid of the vote for them, because that's how laws are made. Obviously, they protested this, and a number of white men sided with them because they saw this as, quote, an ominous and dangerous precedent to voting rights. Because if you can say, well, the voting rules are different because of the color of your skin, then they can say that for anything. They can be like, oh, well, you're Irish, so you can't vote. Or, oh, you voted Federalist the last election, so you can't vote this year. Like, they could do whatever they wanted, which, yeah, they could. And so there was actually some level of biracial coalition for this. Meanwhile, the arguments against letting black men vote was that this could result in black legislatures, or worse, interracial mingling and marriage. Dun, dun, dun. How scary. Which, considering where we are, some people would still be like, yeah, you can have that. And the racist arguments won out, so by 1840, 93% of free blacks were completely unable to vote, which isn't 100, so technically they could still vote, but yeah, they were basically completely shut out of voting. So here's women in New Jersey exercising their right to vote, at least while they could. Right. Speaking of racism in America, there were more restrictions, not just on voting, but on really just African Americans as a whole. Congress limited naturalization to immigrants, which meant that if you were born here, but you weren't white, you weren't considered a citizen. And if you were an immigrant, you could at least apply to become a citizen, but if you were, again, a free black, or even a Native American, the ones who were here first, you weren't considered a citizen, and you couldn't even apply for citizenship. Various governments were encouraged to adopt separate legal codes for free blacks and slaves versus, the white population, which, yeah. Segregation, public schools, transportation, public places, etc. There was, of course, mob and state-sanctioned violence, so either the people would just get violent and murder a bunch of black folks in the community, or the state would just do it, because they didn't care. Again, we'll get more to that next semester, but there's a great quote by, I think it's W.B. Du Bois, and he says essentially that a system cannot fail that which it was never meant to protect. And yeah, the system as it was never meant to protect African Americans, was never meant to protect slaves or free slaves. It was built by and for the white man, specifically the men. So, for example, in 1822, we had Denmark Vesey here in Charleston, South Carolina. They accused him of following to Saint-Louis Overture's whole Haitian Revolution thing. In reality, he was just a free black in Charleston who had a lot of, well, I wouldn't even say political power. He had a lot of social power. People knew him. He organized churches, mutual aid societies, other black institutions that the people of Charleston would not let stand. So he and 34 of his alleged co-conspirators were hanged, and 18 other men were simply exiled from the city. And the church where supposedly all this insurrection was being planned, the, again, African Methodist Episcopal Church, was torn down. So there wasn't even like, there's not even like a site you can go to today to like commemorate what Denmark Vesey went through. It's like, no, they tore the building down and everything. Now, while this was, of course, common in the South, the North wasn't a picnic either, which, again, is something we'll repeat next semester, unfortunately. Cincinnati had this huge race riot. Was this the one that was 3.5 days of rioting? No, it just mentions. 1829, white residents of Cincinnati attacked black neighborhoods. More than half of the city's black residents fled. Many of them fled to Ontario, Canada. There were other similar riots in Philadelphia. So this was common throughout the North in the early 1800s. So again, this idea of like, oh, once you get out of the South and away from the slavery, everything's fine. It's like, no, the racism's still there. And since they're not citizens, they're not protected by the government. There's literally nothing they can do. Except fight back, which gets them shot by the police. Surprising no one. There's Denmark Vesey. He should have just had a revolution. He'd have been a great revolutionary leader. Look at that guy. There is Cincinnati, because reasons. All right. Back into the politics for a moment. Let's see. So, part of the reason why the civil and political rights of free blacks were rapidly disappearing was because the Federalists were basically gone at this point. If you recall, they kind of supported Britain in the War of 1812, and then the Capitol got burned down, and that nobody wanted to vote for them anymore. But they were the only ones who'd been pushing for abolition laws, so with them essentially out of power, there was nobody pushing for rights for African Americans. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans, being the only game in town, began to split along the same lines that caused the split between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans to begin with, and that was how much federal power they should use. Because as we've seen, I mean, literally even in Jefferson's term, the federal government's been wielding a lot of power. Much of the party had begun to embrace using more federal power, while others wanted to go back to the good old days of Jefferson and us just like buying a bunch of land that wasn't allowed in the Constitution, but don't worry about that part. So in 1824 was the election that caused this whole split. I'll just go ahead and mention this here. Democratic-Republican ticket was split 4 ways. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, who we'll never speak of again, so don't worry about him. Adams and Jackson were the front runners. Jackson technically won the popular vote. However, John Quincy Adams got the support of Henry Clay and therefore all of his electoral votes. So Adams was able to take the win. That said, with it being so close, um, John Quincy Adams could only do so much. Despite being literally the son of John Adams, you can tell from the name. um, Congress mostly opposed him. They were led by Martin Van Buren, who was like Andrew Jackson's right-hand man, and also Adams' own vice president, John C. Calhoun, from the lovely state of South Carolina, also opposed him. So he had very little going on. They slowed down internal improvements with federal money. He did manage to reaffirm an old tariff and then pass another in 1828, which was like literally the only thing he did. He continued a tariff that was already happening and made a new one that included hemp, wool, and molasses, which actually the opposition party was like, hey, this is pretty good. We like this. That was it. John Quincy Adams had 4 years of nothing. It was close, though. Again, Jackson got 99 electoral votes, whereas Adams got 84. But since Henry Clay poured his into Adams, he was able to steal the win. No, I shouldn't say steal. That's got a bad context now. He was able to take the win. Also, though, again, just want to mention this. They really split the electoral votes of these bigger states. So rather than like whoever wins New York gets 36, which would be almost as much as Clay got from 3 separate states and also a little bit of New York, it was split all kinds of ways. Well, 6. Yeah, New York split electoral votes. Adams got 26, Crawford got 5, Clay got 4, and Jackson got 1. So, yeah. I don't know. It feels more realistic than an entire state going one way just because the votes are like 55-45. Anyway, this isn't super important. This is, though. So Adams is in power. He's choosing to, quote, stand for office, which is to say he's not going to make any. If it feels it would be wonderful if there wasn't such a political circus every freaking election cycle. But traditionally, the incumbent didn't run a campaign. They're like, hey, the people know what I can do as president, and if they like that, they can vote for me again. If not, then they can vote for the other guy, basically. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson, along with Martin Van Buren, who again is like a major political operator at this time, had an aggressive run for office, going directly to the voters, national campaign. Let's see what else. John C. Calhoun, which is weird because, again, he was the vice president, but I guess you can just, well, this happens more than just this time, but like you could swap out vice presidents during an election cycle. Whatever. Newspaper campaigns, logo, which was modeled after Jackson's war history days of Old Hickory. That was a thing. I don't know. Reputation as native fighter, Tennessee native, rise to wealth. So he had a lot of support among the West and South. And the support of the 1828 tariff actually got him a bit of pull in the North as well. In response, Adams' supporters were viciously attacking Jackson personally, along with his family, including, in particular, that his wife, Rachel, her divorce from her previous husband was coincidentally close to her marriage to Jackson, which, like, okay, leave him alone. But, no, like I said, sure, politics today is a circus, but it's never been civil. Adams stayed out of the mudslinging, but he never actually told his supporters to stop, which is a thing. Anyway, Jackson absolutely beat the brakes off of Adams. He took every region but New England, which means he did take New York. Jackson and his supporters called themselves the Democracy. Adams and his supporters called themselves the National Republicans. This is where we get the two groups we have today, although politically they shifted during the time of Nixon. So at this time, the Democracy was the more conservative, whereas Democrat Republicans were the more liberal. Although, really, it wasn't even that kind of shift at this point. It was just like based on how they interpreted the Constitution. So here is some of the bloody deeds of General Jackson, which is to say all the people that died under his command. Yeah, he absolutely smoked Adams. That said, a lot of people didn't like him. I will get into this whole SC ordinance nullification thing in a bit, but there was always this concern that because he was going the other way against the traditional Democratic Republicans, that he was going to be some despotic king. No, this is the opposite. Now, this is basically that he's going to take all the power and become a king. Yeah. Now, we'll get into nullification specifically in a minute. Don't know where that is. All right. So, March 4th, 1829, crowds of ordinary citizens flocked to D.C. to watch the inauguration. Let me see here. March 4th, crowds of ordinary citizens came to see their hero's inauguration. By the way, Jackson's wife, Rachel, had died less than 3 months earlier, so he was still, like, in mourning. There was this huge party. He walked alone to the Capitol as vast throngs of supporters waved and cheered. Wealthy planters were jammed shoulder to shoulder with frontier farmers and working men and women. Local African Americans also turned out for the spectacle. Jackson read his inaugural address, took the oath of office, and then rode his horse through the crowds. Meanwhile, as author Margaret Bayard Smith reported, mobs were scrambling, fighting, and romping through the White House reception. Jackson was nearly crushed to death by the, quote, rabble eager to shake his hand. Tubs of punch laced with rum, brandy, and champagne were finally placed on the lawn to draw the crowds outdoors. Yeah, it was wild. It was a very interesting experience. And while Jackson and his supporters were like, hey, this is showing how enthusiastic people are for a shift in the politics, other political leaders saw this as dangerous. Because this was likened to the French Revolution, where it's ruled by the masses. And as I said, that's not how the Constitution was originally written, where you're supposed to be ruled by, like, the elite, because they're the ones that are intelligent and know what they're doing, and the rest of us can just shut up. So there was immediately these various scandals under Jackson, the Petticoat Affair. He appointed Tennessee Senator John Eaton as Secretary of War. He had an affair with a woman thought to be, quote, of questionable character before marrying her, and this was enough for, like, the political wives in D.C. D.C. to snub her at gatherings, which was, excuse me, apparently this huge political thing. It actually resulted in the rest of Jackson's cabinet resigning, which is like real political consequence to what seems like petty shit, but whatever. This did give Democratic Republicans a bit more momentum in Congress, so even though Jackson had, again, beat the crap out of Adams politically, excuse me, National Republicans still had some amount of power. There's also the issue of the spoils system. Oh, this is further down. The spoils system, where Jackson would just appoint friends and other folks that he knew to positions of power because he could. And that, while it was initially called, again, the spoils system, which is a term from war where, if you take a city or whatever, the spoils of war are whatever you steal from the city. This just became the norm. This is why you can be anybody and end up a presidential pick for whatever if the president knows who you are. I'm going to not comment on that as much as I want to. But yeah. So here is Jackson's inauguration. There is a lot happening. There's a lot of drunk people. This dude's getting knocked out of the carriage. The horse is not having a great time. It's chaos. But they were enthusiastic. They were happy to have, a shift from old stuffy Virginia elite presidents to at least somebody different. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of Andrew Jackson, but he was at least a shift. So there's the Petticoat Affair. What was his name again? Eaton. Yeah. And then his kitchen cabinet. He basically just had a bunch of friends that he talked to that would give him advice on what to do, and he would pretty much listen to them over the actual political appointees. Now, when I say a bunch of friends, I mean clearly based on what they're wearing, like dudes he knew from the war. Top military people. So this wasn't just like him and his buddies that drink on the weekends. Although, knowing Andrew Jackson, there might have been a few of those in there. All right. Let's try to knock the rest of this out as quickly as we can so I can go over the real brief stuff in the final chapter. Almost immediately, the coalition that Martin Van Buren had built for Andrew Jackson started to fracture because, well, it was a coalition of a bunch of different people who had a bunch of different ideas, and they just agreed on enough stuff to join together. So obviously, they're going to start splitting on certain things, particularly the tariffs. Southern planters expected Jackson to repeal the tariff of 1828 because, well, they don't like tariffs. Meanwhile, the North wanted him to keep it. So whatever he did, he was going to alienate one side of his party. More importantly, though, before he even made a decision, this led to his vice president, again, South Carolinian John C. Calhoun, writing anonymously in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, suggesting that states had the ultimate power in deciding the constitutionality of laws. This is known as nullification. This is where a state can decide, hey, this federal law affects us negatively, so we're just going to ignore it. We're going to ignore this federal law because we can. The problem with that is, as Jackson gets to, well, here, I'll do this real quick. South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne defended nullification in 1830, said it would be that the tariff will be used to economically crush the South. Meanwhile, Daniel Webster supported the tariff, which is a opposing nullification. Jackson supported Webster, which implies, obviously, he's supporting the tariff and opposing nullification. He did sign a tariff into law in 1832. South Carolina had a convention that approved the ordinance of nullification and then prepared for armed conflict. We were ready for smoke in 1832. Which, just again, for those of us unaware, the Civil War went for another 30 years. We were ready to fight over this thing. it apparently didn't go anywhere because the book just kind of ends with that, because it's like, oh, by the way, he was also doing other stuff with the bank. The bank needed to be rechartered. His opponents expected him to veto it, which would split the party because, again, one side of his party supported it, the other side of the party didn't. And this is when we get back to the Panic of 1819. Because while the Second Bank of the U.S. had stabilized the economy, it was good for, the upper class, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, etc. For regular folks, it was a burden. It demanded specie payments, which again meant gold and silver. You couldn't just use paper money. And in their minds, it had precipitated the Panic of 1819. So Jackson vetoed the charter. Every however many years, the bank has to be rechartered, and Jackson's just like, nah, we just won't do it. And most of the country agreed with him. They felt like the second bank was, quote, dangerous to the liberties of the people. Again, it's a whole economic thing, but point being, even though Jackson was having to make decisions which would split his base, most people were still on board with what he was up to. This is the nullification thing. Consider the power to annul a law, nullification. The United States, assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, yada, 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 yada. So, the thing about laws in America, normally, I should add, is it's a precedent system where if South Carolina, and I did find this and thought it was funny, so I decided to include it. If South Carolina decided, hey, we're not going to follow this tariff that you put in place because it hurts us economically, then any state could do that for any reason. And not just about a tariff, but about any law. And therefore, with that single issue, the federal government becomes powerless. If a state can ignore a law, then any state can ignore a law. Then any state can ignore any law, then the federal government has no real power. That's the cascading thing of nullification here. Meanwhile, again, there was this whole thing of like, Andrew Jackson's going to be this despotic ruler. And again, I'm not a fan of Andrew Jackson. I'll go ahead and say that. But like, I don't really see where they were coming from. It's like, oh, he vetoed the National Bank. Okay, most people wanted that. Like, you guys were arguing that we shouldn't have had a national bank to begin with, because that was going outside the Constitution. But now him making the bank go away is tearing up the Constitution. Make up your minds. So yeah, whole thing. Although it does give us this fantastic image, which is in the book. It's called General Jackson Slaying the Many-Headed Monster, 1836. This is Andrew Jackson literally physically fighting the bank, which has multiple heads because these are the various, like, literal heads of the bank. And it's Jackson, like, going at them with a sword. So, yeah, it's something. Now, something else that Jackson got up to, which was unfortunately very popular at the time, forcing Native Americans out of their homes, more so than we had already been doing. So he wanted to acquire more native land for the southern and frontier settlers, which, again, they were all on board with. That there were actually people within Jackson's administration that were like, hey, maybe we shouldn't, like, completely genocide the natives. Now, those that were against just wiping them out were still Protestant missionaries that were like, hey, we need to go and erase their culture, but, we're going to civilize them by making them give up all their old traditions and stuff, because, white man knows best. Which isn't great, but it's not murdering all of them. So, like, you gotta pick the lesser of two evils, I guess. James Monroe and John Quincy Adams supported the rights of the Native Americans to live on the land that they had, as long as they embraced, again, the missionary goals. So as long as they were allowing themselves to have their culture wiped out, they could stay where they were. Meanwhile, Jackson and his politicians were like, yeah, no, we're just going to force them west of the Mississippi. We did have the Cherokee Nation, which I'll briefly mention here in just a bit more in a minute. They had worked with Jackson against the Creek natives in the War of 1812. They actually adopted a Republican form of government, had John Ross as their president. So what they were doing is not just embracing missionary goals, they were going full like, hey, we're going to do a little America ourselves, and then you guys will have to stand as equals against us and not just like run us over. Well, you know how that goes. They declared themselves a sovereign nation. Georgia legislature rejected this, so the natives were under the jurisdiction of the state, which it goes back and forth a little bit, but obviously they end up getting shipped out west because this is Native Americans in Jackson's America we're talking about. 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, forced the natives to exchange their ancestral lands for land west of the Mississippi. Very much not equal land, even in terms of how good it was for growing food. So we were just taking their land that we know was good for growing things, that they had lived on for generations, forcing them into, well, walking essentially to like Kansas, and then just telling them to work it out between themselves. Jackson sent federal troops to remove the Sauk and Fox nations, slaughtered Chief Black Hawk and the warriors at Bad Axe. The Seminole natives in Florida actually ended up outlasting Jackson's campaign, or Jackson's political career. They fought for a long time before they were finally forced out of Florida. So here's John Ross. Do I have? Yeah, this isn't, I don't think this is quite the Trail of Tears just yet, but we are getting there. Here is the Battle of Bad Axe with the death of Chief Black Hawk, I believe. Yeah. And then Jackson's people politely asking the natives to leave. All right, and that's it for that chapter. War of 1812, Panic of 1819, Missouri and the whole compromise there, and then of course with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So real quick, with the just couple minutes we got left, let me go over the literal 3 things that are on the test from chapter 10. So let me pull that up, which means this is going to go really quickly. So don't worry too much about the details. Let's see. Plantations in the South. Not really important for what we're doing. James Henry Hammond was a piece of shit, though. May safely conclude and firmly believe that American slavery is not only not a sin, but especially commanded by God through Moses and approved by Christ through his apostles. What in the hell? But this was like a big argument during this, prior to and during the Civil War, that slavery isn't bad, and it's not just okay, it's actually a good thing. Slavery life in the South. That's not what we're going for right now. Slavery system. We talked about that already. Ah, yes, here we go. By 1860, cotton was 2/3 of the U.S. export. So, like, most of what we were making worldwide for the entire country was cotton. Not just the South. This is the entire United States. 2/3 of it is the cotton trade. Because, again, Britain has all the textile factories, and they need material, and we're sending them material, and they're more than happy to pay for it. Various cultures. This was like the, oh, right, we do have this. So syncretic culture is a combination of the African, Caribbean, and American cultures to create something unique. Specifically, Gullah is a dialect that combined African words and speech patterns with English. It was largely in the Sea Islands off the coast of the Carolinas. And finally, before we finish, let's get to, oh, sorry, Nat Turner's Rebellion. I guess it was 4. Nat Turner's Rebellion was this real big slave revolt that happened during this period. Killed 57 white men, women, and children, freed more than 50 slaves. However, they were caught by the next day, et cetera, et cetera. And then a large number of blacks were murdered for just no reason because the white people were scared. Okay, we've already got that. That, yeoman farmers. That, come on. Oh, wait. There's John Ross again. He's still important. He's still the president of the Cherokee, by the way. Battle for Texas. We had a war between America and, actually, is that the next one, or? Oh, no, it's right here. So, we had a war with Spain over, not Spain, Mexico over Texas, which middle is mostly Mexico's land anyway, but hey, we're America. And it resulted in, where's it at? The Alamo. Remember the Alamo? There was this big battle at the Alamo between like a few American soldiers and a huge army of, that's all right, of Mexican troops, and they got wiped out. But it's like, oh, it's this great stand for America. It's like, it wasn't our land, though. So, yeah. Anyway, whole thing, Alamo, keep that in mind. We're not doing the rest of the chapter. I just wanted to get those 3 main things out of the way. All right, we're done. I'll see y'all next Monday for the study guide. Y'all have a good break. Yeah, y'all might start class tomorrow, but Wednesday and the rest of the week's off, so. Y'all too, take care.